Okay. Gonna give people a few minutes to come on in. Welcome, welcome. One person watching right now. Let's just check something. Three watching. Yay. Yay, our viewership has tripled in the last few seconds. Oh, hello. So real quick, one thing that I'll get to some housekeeping, but I've noticed that so for example, like this stream is typically like 3 or 4 people, and um, there are way more than 3 or 4 people in the class. So if you know folks who are in this section outside of the class, and I'll send an email out to this effect, but like please nudge people to watch the stream live. That being said, I will teach my butt off for those of you who show up consistently, because you deserve it. Gosh darn it! But um, the rest of the folks don't get the benefit of being able to do this live. So if you know people who are in class but not watching these, get them to watch because this is like the class content. But like I said, those who are showing up, I'm gonna teach my butt off for you. So let's go. Anyway, so today, what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about two things that don't seem terribly related, but they are, which is, visual style, and the visual style thing is going to be a little bit of real talk, because not so much that I see any problems. It's more so that like I want you to know that style is a thing, and it's a thing that you get to play with. That I don't always feel like students let themselves have the time to do. So and part of that goes into like timing is part of your style when you get into animation, and that can be planned via X sheets. So we're going to talk about the sort of artistic aspects of style, the historical aspects of art styles, but then also the practical elements, and then also, again, how to plan things on X sheets. So our topics today is what do we mean by art style and like some aspects of art style, functions of art style, history of art style, how you choose a style, and then how timing like practically and artistically goes into style. So thank you internet for having a thing like the art style challenge where artists can do these exercises for like trying out different styles. And it's a cool social media thing, but it serves a practical purpose, I think, is that lots of artists have their style, and if they are working on a specific project themselves, whether that be their own comic or their own cartoon or even just like commissions, people usually have a set style, but having a style is really only a thing. Like it's good for social media, but it's not always good for like you're not going to be approached necessarily for your style unless you become like a super famous person. So why should you know lots of different styles? Well, so let's talk about that. Like let's talk about art style. Everything you ever didn't think you needed to know about style. So here's somebody who's really stylish. But to talk about style, we have to talk about art and what art is. So here's the thing, and I'm gonna say this. We've had this discussion a lot in the class chat I want you all to know that I am not saying this to anybody. First of all, these slides like have existed. Part of this slideshow is cobbled together from other slideshows that I've had for years. So this is kind of like, even though I made the slide deck this morning, it's like cobbled together from a few things. Meaning that I've been lecturing about this stuff for years. So like, again, if we've had this conversation recently, don't take it personally. This is just something that this is a drum that I've been beating for a long time. But also, like, you know, you should know that these are common discussions that young artists are always having. As long as I've been teaching, again, going on 11 years, you know, young upcoming artists have been talking about style and content in these ways. So here are some like important historical and conceptual elements to talking about art style that, you know, will hopefully be helpful to you. So the best digital artists I know have a lot of traditional art experience, and this is why I'm a really big proponent of, you know, digital artists not throwing out the fine arts. And like, I get it, because when I was learning digital art in college, I you know, that was like my thing, was I was the guy that knew 3D Studio Max. That was like kind of my brand within my nose is itchy, sorry. Within my class, was that I was a person that knew this complicated 3D software, and that got me a position even on like a team. You know, in this one project, was like they wanted a 3D modeler, so they were like, oh, we need Chris Totten, he's a 3D modeler. But, you know, and so for a while that was like a thing, right, for me. But as I developed as an artist, as I had more experience, I learned that, you know, all of this stuff is interrelated, and all of these things can inform each other. And in many cases, I could flip-flop between digital and real art to like come up with lots of different elements to my art. And you'll see some of that in this lecture. So the best digital artists I know also have like a lot of traditional art experience. So my friend Dan Silber, who's a pixel artist, he because he is such a good fine artist, he is better at encapsulating things like proportion, like composition, like scale, like anatomy in his pixel art. So, you know, even though he's doing a lot of digital art, it still incorporates elements of traditional art. And, you know, and again, it's so pervasive that it's a meme called Game Art Student Bullfrog that is from like 2013. But, you know, you have like, this is kind of a thing in digital art communities, that people sort of like think, oh, well, I don't need to know how to draw, I'm a 3D artist or something like that. And what they realize is that, you know, so this is, again, cobbled together from an older talk. This is actually from a GDC talk I gave in 2017. You know, this is something where if you don't understand traditional art, you'll call somebody over and say, hey, come look at my cool digital art, and it'll be bad. It'll be horrible. And if anybody doesn't know what I'm picking on here, it is the well-documented to be bad art of Rob Liefeld, who created Deadpool. There are several articles online called 40 of the worst Rob Liefeld drawings. But basically, it's, you know, if you don't know why this is bad, here's what Captain America would look like if he was actually proportioned like this in real life. Here's the thing about art style, is when you talk about art style plays with the rules of art. And you should be breaking art rules. That's okay. But, and somebody in the last class brought this up, you know, when you see comic book artists, especially of women, you know, they put them into weirdly proportioned or contorted states where There are blogs of like they would draw skeletons of the characters if they were posed that way, and it's just like there are injuries happening. There are also blogs about like drawing male comic book characters like female comic book characters, which are really funny. So, all of this is to say that even though you should break rules with your style, you shouldn't break bones. So, break rules, not bones. That's a good rule for this kind of drawing, and to understand how style works. But, it's not uncommon for us to lose that because, the problem with digital art, with learning digital art, is that we emphasize the digital portion way more than we do the artistic portion. And you see, and the problem is that like a lot of what we do in digital art wouldn't exist if not for the traditional part. So, like think about music like from Dragon Quest III. If you know anything about Koichi Sugiyama, who is a kind of a terrible person, but his music is cool and based on Bach. If you understand that, then you can start to see the links where traditional arts start to inform the work we do. Now, why do we care about that? First of all, I've talked about this like before where I said, your value is not the software it's your creativity. So know this then, is that your skill in this field is not to be conflated with the knowledge you have of how to operate a program. Knowledge of program operation is fine, but it's your artistic skill that actually makes you a good artist. And it's your creativity that allows you to make unique works. So you need to study the principles of art, and how style works in order to make good stuff. It's not just, the Photoshop class, the Blender class, the Maya class. Because if you don't understand these things, bad things can happen. So let's talk about digital art and like what kind of art it is. And this is where we get to talk about art style. So what is an art style? It's a distinctive manner which permits the grouping of related works into distinct categories. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, it's if a group of artworks have some similar component such that they constitute a trend in an artwork. And so this is where you get like multiple works by one artist look the same and thus are their art style. If you get multiple artists working in a style, that is how art movements happen. And when multiple works appear with a similar style in a short period of time, that's when you hear the term zeitgeist happen. Now, an art movement might be it might be a group of people, it often is, that know each other and that decide to kind of like learn from each other and work off of each other a little bit. The way like a team of athletes would, have like little inner competitions to push each other farther. That's how often like art movements can act. And but art movements are often, not always, a group of people who are together. Zeitgeists are usually when you see those things that are like, isn't it weird that 3 video games came out with in the same year with like nearly the same title or about the same weird topic or subject matter or aesthetic? Something must have been in the air. That's what you get. That's what you talk about when you talk about a zeitgeist. So in terms of art style, again, it's groupings. So, one useful thing to understand with style and how to understand style is like the history of art styles. Because if you can understand the history of art style, you can understand what it meant when art styles, I guess, broke out of, how art style is enforced and then how it can sort of be freed. Because last week we looked at character creation, and one dominant style that you see in digital art, not so much in animation, a lot in games, is a sort of painterly digital style that we associate with Photoshop. You do see that in everything. But this style has elements, I'm not going to call this realism, because that's actually a distinct art, like historic art style, but we'll call it idealism, meaning that like, you know, all these characters are kind of perfectly proportioned and they're kind of like the most physically fit and they're like epic, cool characters. They've got swords and shields and maces and, you know, they're of like, and they have magic and all these other cool things, right? You know, they're painted in a way that gives them a sort of high fidelity look. And you see that again, often in digital art, often in the games industry, where everything is epic and big and huge. And it's all escapist. And there's a precedent for that in the fine arts. And it's called history painting. So once upon a time in this, between the 17th and 19th centuries, there were, let me go back a few. There was what's called the Academy art period, which was when art style was strictly enforced by, you know, not only the subject matter of art, but also like what you could and could not have in a painting if you were painting specific genres of art. So, you know, we think of genre today as like, I'm going to go see a sci-fi movie, or I'm going to go see a romantic comedy, or I'm really in the mood for a first-person shooter, or I'm really in the mood to play a platformer, or to watch a comedy. But we don't normally think of we've lost this meaning of genre as it was originally used to mean different, like the hierarchy of arts and of painting especially. So a history painting is, according to the genre system, the highest form of painting. That was religious scenes or historical scenes or scenes from mythology painted on big canvases, and this was to show the like technical skill of an artist. And then it would go down like portrait genre, which is scenes of everyday life, landscapes, animals, and still life. And the idea is that there were rules for each of these styles, and if you broke the rules, you could not get into gallery shows, and if you couldn't get into gallery showings, you couldn't live as an artist. So these were enforced pretty strictly. And we see something of the same thing happening where, like, big epic scene. We see these things happening in, again, I'm speaking as somebody who's in the game industry a lot, but it's a little lighter in animation because animation, it's an older field, so it's worked through some of these things. But you still see like styles which are enforced by, sort of the gatekeepers of art, right? And what happened in the fine arts was that this guy, Gustave Courbet, comes along and is like, cool, big things for, mythology scenes. That's awesome. But what if, hear me out, what if, no, don't walk away. What if I painted my uncle's funeral? No, he's nobody, he's not a big deal. He's just a commoner, okay? What if his funeral, but 24 feet by 10 feet? And, monocles fell into glasses of champagne, pearls were clutched, and people were like insulted by this very idea. But that's how we have the burial at Ornans. And that's roughly around the time also that you see art styles really bust out, because look at this timeline image. The dots on the line are markers for centuries, and the diagonal lines are the art styles, like the dates of art of beginnings of art styles, and it's pretty consistently except for like between the 16th and 17th century, which like it must have been a spicy time. But, you know, it's pretty consistently like two art styles per century until Romanticism and Realism come along, and then boom, you know, you start to get Impressionism, Pointillism, Fauvism, Art Nouveau, Modernism, Cubism, Surrealism, Pop Art, Dada, all of these pieces, all of these art styles. You know, look at how far apart the 19th and 20th century are, and then the 20th century into the 21st century. These art movements, there are so many of them happening so fast. Art really, you know, flourished once they broke out of like the boundaries of reinforced style. And that's again really important, because what you get is that art became not about following specific guidelines and fitting certain aesthetics. This should sound familiar, especially if you want to become a game artist. Because like to give you a sense of what I'm getting at, this is the stuff we're dealing with. When you do 3D, what does everybody teach you to try to do when you learn 3D? They try to teach you to do photorealism. Well, that's not the only thing you can do in 3D. It's an option, but it's not always the answer. You know, Up isn't photorealistic. You know, a lot of animated movies you watch, the characters are not photorealistic. Even if they're portraying people, it's not that they're all exactly photorealistic people. They are usually abstracted in some way that cartoon characters are abstracted. You can get kind of thrown into... It can be kind of confusing because, like, a lot of CG movies, they still use, like, photorealistic materials on those differently proportioned characters. So you have, like, a little dissonance there, which, you know, I kind of wish, like, sometimes animation would resolve a little bit and experiment more with non-photorealistic materials. But, you know, typically, like, that's where people get thrown off, is they are taught to do photorealism, so they always try to do photorealism without really stopping to think there can be other things I can do. And that's really important to know as an artist, because my hope for you is that you start to, you know, you use the time that you have while you're in school to be experimental, to try new things. What I want you to do, what I challenge you to do, is not always to land on one style. You know, in learning all these tools, I hope you take the opportunity, because you may never have this opportunity again once you get a studio job where they will tell you what your art must look like. You may never have this opportunity to explore again. So you should take it. And, you know, so for example, like, asking the chat, while I'm going to take a drink of water and wait for the chat to catch up, who are the artists that painted these paintings? Anybody know the artists that did these 4 paintings? Somebody says, I could not tell you. Well, all right. What if I told you it's a trick question? These are all Pablo Picasso. And so all of these are Pablo Picasso. And what I'm getting at is that, again, young artists, which you would be, are always striving for their style, or the mark that they're going to make, or their identity. So I hear these things a lot, excuse me. You know, oh, I'm really devoting myself to 3D, or 3D is my specialty, or digital painting is my specialty, or, oh man, I'm trying to like figure out my style. And you know, it can be important to continuously play and experiment with your style and to try to find opportunities so that you don't, like, I'll be honest, I don't even know what my style is. I mean, I think there's like certain things I fall back on. I would probably say my illustrations for La Mancha are probably closest to my style. But even that style has leftovers of like other times I was trying to mimic other people's styles. It's particularly like the period where I was trying to learn how to draw like Tony Moore, who drew the first few issues of The Walking Dead, because I was making a game that was heavily influenced by The Walking Dead. So like that's a little bit left over. There's like some leftovers in my visual art style from that period. But like, you know, I say this as a person, my advice for you as a person who like used to do this stuff, is very self-aware of that, but is now like 35 years old and is, you know, looking back and is like, you know, I'd go back in time and be like, kid, chill. You know, experiment with your style. And here's the reasons why. First of all, what does this all mean for your commercial art careers? Well, as an artist, it's important to play with style for several reasons. The first, very practically, is that if you can do different styles, you can increase your ability to be hired. I have to break this to you. You're not famous yet. And what I mean by that, you're not famous yet, is that somebody's not going to come and be like, I need the, you know, I'm not going to say names because, you know, FERPA on stream, but, you know, I'm going to, like, I need your style. They might hire you because you're an artist. They might hire you because you have shown previous experience drawing a certain type of subject matter. So, for example, I actually had this come up last year where, like, part of my brand is that I'm the, like, game design and architecture guy, right? That's, like, the thing I'm known for, and in the game industry. And the because I have that architectural background, a friend of mine who is publishing a book about applying like certain architectural creative principles to like games, not in the way I have, but like a different set of principles to games. Like, he asked me, could you help me illustrate this, because I need somebody with an architecture background to help me figure out, like, visualize these concepts and turn them into illustrations. And I was like, great, sure, I'd be happy to help. But he got another friend of ours to also start working on the book beforehand. So for the art style to be cohesive, and he wanted it to be cohesive, he's like, well, here are some of Jason's pictures. Can you do Jason's style that he's illustrating in? So I'm very adaptable. I can do lots of different art styles. So I was like, yeah, sure, that's fine. And I did. I was able to mimic my other friend's style. So it's almost like he was art directing. I sent off roughs to make sure they were like, yes, this looks great. And then I, you know, just kind of went full steam ahead, did the commission, and, you know, got paid. But that's an example of, you know, a practical example of how, you know, I was not the artist in on the ground floor, so I had to adapt to the style that was already established. And that, when you are a commercial artist, is something you'll have to do. If you are applying for jobs at a studio, for example, you'll often be given an art test where they will say, well, if you'd like to work on this show or on this comic or in this game, we're going to please make this list of drawings and assets according to this style that we have established already, and do it in this time frame. So why do they have you do an art test? Well, they evaluate, one, can you produce a amount of art on tight deadlines? And usually it's a little bit of a crunch, and that's the point. They want to see if you can do it. But then the artist can also, they want to see if you can produce work in the studio's preferred style. So here are two art test images, one for an animator that's worked at like Nickelodeon and places like that, and then one for the art test on the right. The guy was trying to get a job working for Wizards of the Coast on Dungeons and Dragons books, and he said on his blog he actually did not get this job. So that's kind of like what an art test would be, is like he, you saw the post that he had for this test. It actually had like maybe 10 different pieces he had to do, including, environments like this. So here's a semi-related example, but like maybe a little more on the creative end. Another reason to be flexible with style, and a more fun one, is that by not being a servant of only one style, you can play with styles project by project and use style as like an element of the artistic direction of the project. So, and then it becomes a selling point. So like, let's take comic book artist David Mazzucchelli, for example. Here's one of his pages that's in a collected edition of Batman Year One. So it's like he has an afterword where he talks about his life drawing Batman. So here's one of his sample pages that he produced trying to get a job at DC Comics in the 70s and 80s. And this is like a very 70s and 80s comic book style. It's a very typical style of that era. And so like maybe that's his, like, if you were to tell him to draw a thing, that's like the native drawing style, right? But when they did Batman Year One and he was the artist for it, he didn't just rest on a style. What he did was, Batman Year One it was published in '86 and was a retelling of the origin story of Batman. So they went for this 1940s influenced noir style to fit the era that Batman originally came out in. It doesn't take place in the 40s, but it has a visual illustrative style that makes it look like something potentially from that era. And, it's not even meant to look like the comics did. It looks way better than the Batman comics, or like the original Batman comics did. Their comics from that era were kind of like clumsily drawn in a lot of cases. Not uniformly, but in a lot of cases. And I would say like early DC comics would be the same. But he didn't just use the style of his sample pages. Because he went for that noir look, he deviated from that typical style and went for like lots of inky black patches of black filled in ink, used a ink brush to full effect to get like different sizes of strokes. And then he made Bruce Wayne look like Gregory Peck, a famous actor, that was in a lot of movies in the 40s and 50s, to give this idea of being an older comic. And, if you pair that with the way that the comic would have been printed at the time, you get a result like this, which does look like a very aged comic and has a like materiality to it that gives it an appropriate style. If you get a collected edition of this now, everything is very crisp and clear, and it loses some of that agedness, but the visual style still reads very much like a much older comic. To the point where like, my dad was flipping through it. It's like, man, this looks like it was drawn, before I was born, and it wasn't. It was drawn like a year after I was born. So, it was. But that's how style works. Like they wanted to evoke this mood. And they used style to become a part of that storytelling and a part of that feeling. So we're going to stick with Batman. This is where I get to talk about art history and Batman. We're going to talk about one of my favorite comics of all time, which is Batman The Long Halloween by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. So this comic gets a lot of flack from like armchair internet critics and Reddit people for its visual style. And the thing they don't like is that it uses exaggerated elements, like Batman's cape is big enough to be a tarp that covers a car, in some shots. Not in all shots, but in a lot of shots. Likewise, Wayne Manor seems to like undulate in size, where some, the same hall is very big and some the same hall is very small. And people are like, that's not logical or realistic. Well, what they miss is that Sale is not an artist who illustrates scenes literally and leaning on logical consistency. He uses the layout, he uses graphic elements to evoke feelings and emotions. It's not that, like, yes, Bruce Wayne is literally in Wayne Manor, but Wayne Manor then becomes this idea, and Bruce's positioning in Wayne Manor becomes this idea to evoke something like emphasizing that Bruce Wayne is lonely. Or, look at the scene on the left between Batman and Calendar Man. The way that this is supposed to be perceived, not only is it riffing on Silence of the Lambs, but we are to understand that they are on different sides of glass, because they are in Arkham Asylum, and Calendar Man is in his cell. He's a madman, a criminal madman. And you get that from the busyness of all the newspaper, like the obsessive newspaper clippings around his cell. And, you also get the idea of the cell not only from his fingertips smushing against the glass, but also from the high contrast lighting that evokes the idea of an overhead fluorescent light. Batman, even though he's standing like physically only a few feet from him or like right next to him, come on, Batman, social distance, he is in much more dimly lit hallway. There is lower contrast on him. So, an effective, and his part of the thing is relatively calmer. Because like Batman's a little mad, but not quite as mad as the criminals who he hunts. And, that's how it evokes the idea of this like criminal, threat to society that is Calendar Man. Which, if you don't know who Calendar Man is, he's a criminal who commits crimes, in accordance with certain dates. And that's why he's obsessed, is because somebody's kind of like taking his bit a little bit by killing people on holidays. So then on the right, on the flip side, you have another example, actually one of my favorite examples, where, if you know anything about Batman, you know that Poison Ivy is a villain that can hypnotize men. And the effect that Poison Ivy has on a character at one part in the comic is that is so overwhelming, so overpowering, that on that right frame, they drew her to be more of like a graphic element. She almost looks like, if you're familiar with the cover of The Great Gatsby, it looks like the woman's face on the cover of The Great Gatsby. She's almost like an atmospheric condition more than an illustration of a character. They didn't draw the contour of her jawline. And somebody might be like, oh, that's not realistic. But that's not the point. The point is that they are showing you how overwhelming Poison Ivy is. And, and her power is. And that's why it's a highly effective frame. And why, again, I really like that particular page. But, it's taking away the literal element of the illustration and focusing on style and on color to communicate with the reader, to communicate like sort of ethereal elements with the reader. And there's an argument for what happens where if you lean on accuracy and realism too much. So if we look at the 1925 movie The Lost World, which is one of the first monster movies, based on the Arthur Conan Doyle story where like dinosaurs are transported to London and then stomp on stuff. The filmmakers for that movie depicted the dinosaurs realistically and with like realistic sizes. And, the downside of that is that if a dinosaur is like 20 some feet tall, you get that, or 40 some feet tall, that's what you get right there. Is you get a shot where the dinosaur is not looking that intimidating when it's stomping around on a bridge, that it can't really hurt. Whereas if you look at 1933 King Kong, they clearly learned from this. They had to break rules to do it, but the way Kong is put in every shot, the goal is to make him look big and intimidating in whatever context he's in, no matter what. And, in the movie, that means he's portrayed anywhere from 24 feet tall to 48 feet tall to hundreds of feet tall, because they wanted to get the shot they wanted to get. So they actually had multiple different models of King Kong to get these different effect shots. And it's inconsistent if you're being kind of picky, but the effect is there, and that's why King Kong was such a huge success. And again, in the days before people pointing all this stuff out on the internet, sure, some people probably figured it out, but it didn't matter as much. And the other reason to do this is, frankly, and I say this as a person who, like I said, freely kind of goes back and forth between styles and does a lot of experiments with materials, incorporating real materials and digital materials, scanning in paper cutout figures to add texture, like in, my game Liziski's Revenge, which is in the upper left-hand square here. Those are all paper cutouts. All those shapes. I could have just done that in Illustrator or in Photoshop in 2 seconds, but I wanted the game to have a grit to it that added some realism, even if it's a subtle thing. Likewise, the zombies on the left, they're digitally painted, but the drawing is an ink drawing that's in a sketchbook of mine. And then the ones on the upper right and bottom left corner are watercolor paintings that I did for a card game I put out. The point all being is that sometimes, when you do a project and you spend a lot of time doing one particular art style, at least for me, when I do my next project, I want it to be the exact opposite art style. Stephen King once said of writing, because he did when he finished the Dark Tower series, he said that he was going to retire from writing, and then he very much did not. And people asked, well, why did you say that? And he said, well, if you're stuck on a desert island and you only have blueberries to eat, and then you're rescued, and somebody says, hey, would you like a slice of blueberry pie? You're going to say no. And that's kind of, what drawing a particular style for a while can feel like. So, again, another reason to learn how to do different styles, sometimes it just is a good way to alleviate boredom. So why and how do you pick art styles? Well, again, as a young artist, I'll tell you this, there's no right answer. And that can seem very intimidating. And that's okay. But, the way you pick an art style is really, you just ask yourself a few questions. One of them is what feeling do you want to evoke? So here's another Loeb and Sale comic called Superman for All Seasons. And they did a few things to establish the art style. So a lot of the characters are drawn in the way that Tim Sale draws characters, but it feels very different from Batman Year One, where it's just how much, let's have lots of inky blacks in the panel. They looked at, well, when we were in Smallville, we want it to feel like a Norman Rockwell painting. And Norman Rockwell, if you don't know, he's a mid-20th century painter who, drew these realistically rendered but very expressive, almost cartoon, but not quite cartoon, scenes of American life. They're kind of like Americana. And there is a particular cultural feeling you get when you look at a Norman Rockwell painting. And that was a precedent. They wanted to call back to those precedents, that work that came before, so that they could evoke an emotion in the viewer. Sometimes So like, do you have a feeling you want to evoke? Maybe that feeling is used because you mimic an art style of something familiar, and don't be afraid of being influenced by a style. That's okay because again, we are artists. That is how art works. Nobody's gonna, you know, anybody who comes down on you, unless you were like plagiarizing, but if you are drawing in a style or inspired by a style but making your own thing clearly, the people that would say poo poo for that is they don't know art. They're not artists, they don't know art, and they don't have a sophisticated way of talking about art. We see this a lot in game art where there are people nowadays. The trend seems to be anytime there's like a hand drawn game, people will say, "Oh, it looks like a Flash game," because they only are aware of like video games and like the few ways video games have ever looked, right? Um, Whereas somebody with a much broader cultural context would be like, "Well, that looks like a comic book, and that looks like a Flash cartoon, and that looks like anime, and that looks you have much more of a better cultural landscape from which to pull and identify something's influences." So, precedents. Do you want to experiment with art style? So I just posted in the Discord a set of screenshots from a game I worked on in 2014 called Zup. It's another one that was published by this company that no longer exists, E4 Software. But they told me, well, we want it to look like South Park, not like exactly like South Park. They didn't, want it to be. They didn't want it to be South Park, but they wanted a cutout style. But they wanted it to be like bright and cheery. And so I was like, well, how much do you want it to look like that? Because, South Park has long since not done the work in paper cutout stop motion, but I'm like, well, I'm really tired of doing 3D polygon stuff. I would welcome the opportunity to like go to a craft store and buy some stuff and maybe scan it in and see if I can make game assets out of it. And they're like, yeah, sure, whatever, just make it look like this. So I went to a craft store, I bought foam, like craft foam, colored craft foam, and I made assets for this game. I still have them in my house. I should probably like frame them or something, but they're in a bag in my basement, and they became a video game, because you just like I made them, I scanned them in, glued them together, and I arranged them digitally in such a way that they became these puppets and these figures in this like avoid the obstacles game, like an upwards endless runner, I guess you could call it. But basically it's like you had to avoid obstacles while a character with an inflatable head flew into the stratosphere. But I wanted to experiment, so that became the art style, is like let Chris mess around with weird art materials. And then there's something like, that's not to say that you can't, if you are working on for somebody else with a style, that's not to say you can't have some signature, and we'll look at that in a second. But, there are little ticks that even if you are working in art styles will always be part of who you are, and we'll look at that in a second. But before we do that, I should say color is part of art style. That's something you want to consider when you're doing this work, is color. We talked about color scripts, which are top-down storyboard-like sets of images that are, it's not over the course of a scene. This one kind of is because it's part of a short film. But like if you were doing an entire movie, you might have one picture from each scene. But the point is that you show what all the colors throughout the piece are. And you see the flow of color and the flow of moods over the course of the piece. Because that's what color is really for. It's for establishing mood. So, here it begins with a kind of like, it's cool and it's night. It's a little creepy. It's just a little creepy, but it's generally kind of like not so bad. But then it adds more green and white and yellow and green and white and yellow till it builds up to the point where you are just like, completely engulfed in this like otherworldly alien glow. And, you see on the bottom, there's a little strip that has like the color palette, but how the color transforms over the course of the entire movie. It transitions to a much, it shows you like almost the emotional journey through color. And if, we look at video games, you see this happening especially with what's called the Super Game Boy. And you see it in indie games too. I think indie games are really good at this. The game Hollow Knight is very good at this. And, in fact, now I'm kicking myself for not including pictures of Hollow Knight in this slideshow. But that game in particular is very good with using big color swatches for mood in a sector of the game. It does that not only for setting the tone, like are you in like a poisonous place? Are you in a creepy place? Are you in the dark underbelly of the world? Are you in the, I shudder to call anything bright and cheerful in that game, but like, are you in the naturalistic, more comfortable part of the world, which is still super difficult the first time you go through it? Or, that helps with navigation. You always know, oh, I'm in the purple part. Oh, I'm in the green part. But you also get like a mood there, right? Limited games with limited capabilities or unlimited hardware are super fun to look at this with, because you learn how to make the most out of the least, but making the most out of the least can actually help you like be really evocative. So here's two SNK fighting games. The Game Boy game, which is based on like a arcade fighter from the company SNK. In the article F the Super Game Boy by game developer Christine Love, she talks a lot about the Super Game Boy, which, if you don't know, is this peripheral for both Super Nintendo and Game Boy, where it's a cartridge. You'd put it into your Super Nintendo, take your Game Boy game, you put it into the Super Game Boy, and you can play the Game Boy game on the Super Nintendo. Often with like, because Game Boy games, when I was a kid, were black and white, it would colorize them for you. Well, sometimes the colorization was like done kind of cheaply, but games that really did a good job and used that colorization to full effect would do things like, if something's a still image, you can make it very colorful because of the way that you could like assign colors on a Game Boy screen I'm not going to get into. But if it was a moving image, like in actual gameplay, you usually saw a limited color palette. But they would do things like here, it's a nighttime city, so everything should be like different shades of purple. And that creates this like moody, evocative nighttime scene. Versus the, graphically superior, but not as evocative original game where, it's just like, oh, we have every color, let's use every color. It looks nice, I'm not saying it looks bad, but it doesn't have the same, like, mood lighting sense that you get when you look at something like this. So there's a reason to go with limited color palettes. And having that limited capability can really make you master the style of that you can do with colored palettes. So again, Donkey Kong 94, Super Game Boy game. They wanted to create sort of like a warm, welcoming forest feel. So lots of greens and orange/brown. And then also in the city, purple and yellow. Those are each complementary colors. So warm reddish, reddish orange is going to complement, greenish yellow or green blue, whereas purple and yellow are going to complement each other. What I mean by that is, if we look at this color wheel, and I really love this image of a color wheel because it not only shows the colors, but it shows like graphical hints of what those colors can represent. So you see like the leaves on green, the kind of blue rippling water. The red kind of looks like lava to me, and it's weird because this came from like a rug website, but it's a really cool image, so that's why I threw it on here. But when you hear the term complementary color, you're talking about colors that are on the opposite end of the color wheel from each other. So red and green complement each other. So you see that in action here. The reason you don't often literally see full-on red and full-on green is that that's associated with Christmas. But blue and orange, they are complementary. Yellow and purple, I actually use that for my studio. Its color scheme is yellow and purple, and those things look really good together. So understanding the color theory of your scenes can be super important in establishing moods and feelings and tone. Let me know if there are any questions, by the way. My voice gets tired, so I love to hear from you. I mentioned signatures. One example of a signature is animator Richard Williams loved geometric patterns and loved checkerboard things especially. So in his kind of never quite finished film, The Thief and the Cobbler, which, to give you some background on, this was a film that he wanted to make since like the 60s and was in like various states of development for a long time. He finally got it greenlit in the 80s, but it went over time, over budget, and was like kind of seized by the studio that let him make it and finished in a way that did not fit his original artistic vision for it. So, it is available in like theatrical versions, but they're not considered very good. So what fans have done is they've taken his original storyboards and animatics and spliced them together, and it really gives you an idea of how much of this movie was not actually finalized and animated, but it's spliced all together into a more close to his original vision version. But one signature that you see is that he put a lot of this love for geometric patterns, sprinkled it all throughout the movie. And you can see, if you do want to check this movie out, you can see a fan-made cut called the Recobbled cut, which is typically seen as like the best cut of the movie. But, these elements come all throughout it. Warning, if you do watch it, it has some like not quite great for 2020 depictions of like women. But other than that, like, it is a really masterful work of animation. And so Williams did the text, one of your recommended texts, the Animator Survival Kit. And it, apparently it broke his heart so much that he couldn't finish this the way he want. You see like him talk about things that seem like they're from this movie or draw characters that seem like they're from this movie in that book, but he never quite just draws them the way he reproduces images from other things he's done. So you can tell this is like a sore spot for him. So how do you enforce these things? Or how are they enforced to you if you are the junior artist? So if you're the art director, you have to tell other people how to draw in the style that you want. If you are the junior artist, somebody needs to tell you how to draw in the style they want. How is that done? It's done through style guides, which is a set of explicit directions of best practices for drawing and animating characters. So it's basically the do's and don'ts. And you have to later on in the semester produce one of these. You have to like come up with 5 do's and 5 don'ts. But, for example, here are the do's and don'ts from the King of the Hill style guide. So, how to draw Peggy's hair, how to draw characters sitting down and standing up, how characters are supposed to eat and how they're not supposed to eat. And then you're supposed to like how to draw everything from like how characters move to how they are drawn to how like what to put in scenery and not put in scenery. For example, see no desert cacti or tumbleweed shots. That's not this part of Texas we're depicting. So when they would send animation overseas, they had to be like, you're gonna think Texas and you're gonna think tumbleweed cacti shots, but that's not this part of Texas. So they had to almost overcome like cultural stereotypes of what that part of Texas that they were depicting was. And that's what a style guide was helpful for. Any questions? Let me know. I'm going to take a drink. So, timing. Like, I know you're thinking, well, we're supposed to talk about X sheets. What does that have to do with any of this? Well, timing is part of your style. And we've talked a lot about timing and why timing decisions are made. And one thing that you should take away from style is that there are a lot of creative reasons to do style, but there are a lot of practical reasons to do style. Maybe something is more detailed, less detailed than you have time or budget for. And the same thing happens with timing. So we've talked about timing already as a element of, how much budget was there to produce a piece of animation? And so how much work did they do for the animation? So like, look at this GIF from the Flintstones. The Flintstones came on TV the other day and I was watching it for a little while. And I was like, man, I never noticed it as a kid, but look at how in each of these shots, only one part of a character is actually moving. And like, maybe it's their mouth and an arm, but if Wilma is dusting, Wilma's entire body will be still except for her mouth and the arm that's dusting. And you see this shot here where, Fred is talking, his entire body is still, but his head moves. And same thing for Wilma and Pebbles, their entire bodies are still. So that's like on a different cell, and then they only have to like animate small parts of like a top cell. So you think about how economical that animation is, but that it's not quite what you'd call the cartoon modern. It's not fully of that style, but that in the 50s that'd be like, oh, this is how we do it on the cheap. In the 2010s, people started writing about that as an art movement. So a lot of times what you'll get in the academic world of art, animation, and games is that somebody will observe trends that occurred at a certain time and say, yes, we acknowledge these practical factors, but that resulted in an art movement. So, you get this sense of the cartoon modern, where, cartoons from around this time produced for these specific things. Not as much Hanna-Barbera. I mean, I maybe need to read the book Cartoon Modern. I'm aware of it. I need to read it probably. But I would definitely say it fits more like Gerald McBoing Boing or things like that. But those practical reasons became an art style. So, what other things might influence your timing style? Is it detailed, like those Evangelion characters we looked at, or do you want them to be smoothly animated like the Sleeping Beauty characters? And that results in different timing styles. Handmade aesthetic versus modernity. So we talked about why do you use 2s versus why do you use 1s? Well, if you're animating on 2s with claymation or with CG, you want maybe to have a more handmade aesthetic like Aardman Animation wants when they make Shaun the Sheep. They want to, speak back to their origins, making like actual claymation? Or do you want it to be stop motion that takes advantage of the smoothness of modern technology, so you animate everything on 1s like the movie Missing Link? And then again, looking back at that, maybe you want to make a cartoon modern work like this, like that looks like the work of the cartoon modern era in 2020. So you'd look at how timing and art was done in those days, why they made certain decisions, and you mimic those elements of them, even though you are not making that. Like, you might make a work of cartoon modern work with actually devoting yourself to the timing and the production methods of that era, but you don't need to worry about budget, but you choose to explore that style anyway as though you did. That would be, are you doing sort of a historical callback or mimicry? And those are all things you can do. So X sheets are how you plan all this out. So let's talk about real quick how you actually fill out an X sheet. And so I put this into the Discord, into the animation links channel, but here's a link to an X sheet. Notice I say an X sheet, not the X sheet. There are lots of different formats for X sheets. None of them are more right or wrong than anyone else, but as a teacher, I should probably provide you with a link. So here's a link. So let's talk about generally how X sheets work. So this is from Animation Crash Course by Eric Goldberg, i.e. your textbook, i.e. read the chapter, because it's going to provide more thorough even than I'm going to do here breakdown of this. But when you fill one of these out, you start with your scene and animator info, and this is basic. It's just like, what scene is it? Who are you? And the reason you sign your name to it is like, if anybody ever asked any questions, like if you're working on a team and they use your X sheet and they see something that's amiss or they want to ask about something, they know who to go to. In a lot of other classes, you are going to be working on teams, especially when you have me for the different games classes. And, I generally recommend that teams, for example, if you make an art asset, like a 3D model or a sprite, put your initials on it somewhere in the file name. So, if somebody says, oh, I need a change on this, sprite. I want his red shirt to be blue. Oh, who did it? Oh, CT, that's Chris. Hey, Chris, could you make the red shirt blue? Or something like that. That's why you sign your name to things in stuff. But yeah, the basics, where in the production it is to keep it organized. Then you have the action column. That is basically, what the motions of the cartoon are. Now, remember, all of this is already worked out. This has been scripted and storyboarded. So you are not coming up with this out of your brain. This is stuff that is known already. So you're just kind of laying out how that's going to turn into like drawings. So all that is known, don't panic. And then you have time numbers. So that's like numbers in seconds. So, and you see here too, Goldberg filled in some of this info. So like, where there might be a 2 there, he added like, 204 for himself. So like, remember, this is a tool for you. It's not a quiz. And somebody's not going to like come and smack your hand with a ruler if you do it not quite the right way. This is a tool for you as an animator to plan out your work. So, feel free to like put little notations and things that you need. Feel free to put doodles and everything. Like in here, so you see on the frame column, so to the right of the action column is frames. You see that Goldberg, all the frames are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. He put the digits for 10, 20, 30, etc. Again, to help him. But those are the frame numbers. So, basically next to the motions, you put how many frames that motion is going to take. Now, how do you know that? Well, we talked about rules of thumb for timing for common motions. They're in the Goldberg book. That's why you have the Goldberg book, so that you know. They're in the Williams book because those are just a bunch of animation examples. And then if you have to animate something that isn't in either of those books, what you do is the recommended thing is take a camera, and everybody has a phone camera now. Take your phone, have somebody shoot you doing the motion and act it out. So if I'm doing this one described on this sheet, I would raise my hand, hold it, and then smack the fly, right? Because this is from the fly smacking animation. And in doing that, and you do it realistically, I'm doing it because I don't want to break my desk. I'm doing it slow. But if you did it realistically, then you'd see like, oh, it takes 2 seconds to wind up, 1 second, half a second to smack down, et cetera, et cetera. But that's, acting it out is a great way for animators to figure out their timing. And it's a really common practice. We'll talk about that later in the semester. But that's how you know like how many frames something will take. And then, so to the right of that is the dialogue column. And what that is it is the script written out by sound. Because again, you're down to individual frames. You're going to write down like when each sound occurs in the... Now this is the harder part because you're matching it to, an already existing piece of audio. So you have to be like, oh, at, 30 seconds, this word happens. And I'll show you in a second, because this is a silent piece, but this is where, like, as an animator, you'd write down, like, where each mouth movement is supposed to be. Is it bad to rely on acting things out 100% of the time, or should we try to develop a skill to guessing how long things should take? So I'm glad you asked that, because understand a very important thing about art. All art. Real artists use references. Okay? You are not expected to, again, know in your endless database of brain exactly how everything is going to go. You'll probably over time get pretty good at plotting it out. You'll probably get pretty decent at this. And I will say this, you will make mistakes. If you see in the Show My Work channel, like I'm keeping you updated over the sprites I'm developing for the Little Nemo trailer, I screwed up the timing on that dragon so many times. But all I did was then I'd box select the frames, move the frames, add more drawings, slow the timing down, make it feel better, right? You're going to screw it up. You can always add more paper or take paper away, or, add more frames, take them away. That's fine. So the answer is no, it's not bad. And acting things out, especially for unfamiliar things, is super helpful. So a good example, and one of the ones that I would use when we talk about this, is when they were making Jurassic Park. And they were like, well, we want to do this scene where there's a stampede of dinosaurs, and then the humans, like our main characters, Dr. Grant and the kids, they hide behind the log, and all the dinosaurs like jump over the log or like hop onto the log and then hop over the log. They wanted to plot that out. Well, they didn't have dinosaurs around to figure out how that would look. So what all the animators did is they went out onto the back lot, and where there was like a big length of PVC pipe, some ventilation thing for something. But they went out to where this like big pipe was, and they ran around like dinosaurs and jumped over the pipe. And they filmed themselves doing that, and then they watched that again and again while they were like making the dinosaurs move on their computer. Another example is I work with reference a lot and is getting kind of dependent on it. Yeah, no, reference is like artists use references. I think I can't remember if I mentioned it in this class, but like, oh yeah, I did. I just have books of like people making faces, because that's how those things exist and are published because artists need them. I have a book of different types of weapons because it's like, oh, I need a halberd. All right, that's what a halberd looks like, kind of thing. So yeah, that's normal. Please use references. The people that are like, I don't use references because my art, I want it to be super pure, are usually bad artists. Because their stuff looks like nothing, because they don't have a mental image of what that thing should be. So, their guns suck, their weapons suck, their armor sucks, because they're trying to come up with it instead of basically making it of a patchwork of things. So yeah, use references for the love of God, or whatever deity you may or may not believe in. Animation layers. So on the X sheet, there are animation layers. So basically, each of this is like, think of this as the levels of a rig with the cells on them. So the top one is on the left, and the bottom one is so the background is on the right here. So it's basically like, when do you swap out the cells on each layer? And for drawing purposes, it's like, what frames will there be drawings on? So, and I chose this one because it's a nice simple sheet, but there's only 3 layers here. There's Eric on 2, Fly on 1, and background. Eric is animated on 2s, so there are numbers every 2 frames, so 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc., because that's where you will draw frames for Eric. And those frames, so 1, 2, I don't know, probably about 17 or 19, are where Ray's hand occurs. But do you see how that correlates? And then Fly is interesting because you see he's on frame 1 and then he holds. That line indicates that holds. So you only have, one image of Fly. And it's just held. And same thing for background. Fly disappears at frame 25 when it's smushed. Let's see. I used to try to draw armor without references. Looked like a bunch of duct tape tin cans every time. It's level 1 starter armor. That's even generous. See, but if you were going to draw a bunch of duct tape tin cans, you'd probably want to go look at a duct tape clothing that people like wear to the prom, and then tin cans, and then like cobble together something. So you'd even use references like that. So yes, always use references. Real artists use references. And then background, again, it just holds the entire time. And then this one on the right is camera shot. Now here, the camera stays in the same position. I don't really know camera notation, but for you, let's think of it this way. So you're in Maya, right? You have, let's say you set up a scene and it has camera 1, 2, 3. And, 1 is maybe your far establishing shot, 2 is a close-up, and 3 is like a mid shot. What I would do is, for you, I would say like, okay, frames 1 through 20 is going to be on camera 1. And then it'll switch to, so you'd have like camera 1 and then a line down to frame 21, where you switch to camera 3 because you have a mid shot. So then you'd write camera 3, and then you'd have that go down to like wherever you're going to do camera 2, which is the close-up. But you just kind of like say, on this shot, I'm gonna get footage from this camera for this many frames. That's how I would do it. Again, like if you learn camera notation, which you can look that up. But you can see how this. You can see how that would be used, though. And again, it's not a quiz; it's a tool for you. So don't take it too. Don't get too out of whack about it. So here's an example, just of like how they do the dialogue. So this is from a scene from the cartoon Goof Troop, which was on the Disney Afternoon in the 90s. They're animating the character Max, and you see. The dialogue column has, the actual sounds from the script down to the frame. And then you see in red lettering are the phonemes, which are the mouth shapes that should be. So it's not like you have to draw, different mouth shapes for every single sound. What you have to do is hit certain mouth shapes at certain frames, and then the stuff that's in between will just be in between, right? And what does that mean? So there are mouth shapes that are common to sounds, and for animation purposes, this saves you a lot of time from having to do individual mouth shapes for every single sound somebody makes. you can capture a lot of different mouth shapes for a lot of different sounds with different mouth shapes. So if you have a chart like this, again, using a reference, you'll be able to sit there and be like, oh, okay, he says this, and this word would be, to, or something, it would be like this one to that one to that one. So that's where you'd want to use a reference. And doing mouth shapes for characters can also, in fact, be part of your style guide. So mouth shapes can be part of your style. So, that's it. Any questions? I'm out of water. It's time to stop lecturing for the day when you're out of water. Well, I will be on Discord if anybody has any questions, but thank you for coming to the lecture, and I hope it was useful, and have a good rest of your day.